So welcome to the Patch My PC webinar. We love doing these webinars. It gives us a chance to talk about some of the technologies that we love. And today we're talking about co-management. So it's going to be really interesting. We're going to go doing some deep dives in some particular areas, but also this is going to be useful for those who maybe don't really understand what co-management is, and you may be thinking about it. You've heard the buzzwords. So we'll do two lanes. We'll do a slow lane and a fast lane. Okay, let's get started. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get kicked off. This is a live event. Unfortunately, chat isn't working, but there is a Q&A. So by all means, any questions you have as we go through, pop in the Q&A. We've got a lot of moderators who will answer those questions. And if we feel that the question is something we should discuss, then we'll talk about it as well during the presentation. Cool. Okay, let's get started. We're going to cover very loosely what is co-management. So again, for those who are maybe just starting out, want to know a bit more about it, we'll be talking about that. We'll be looking at some of the value you'll get immediately from enabling co-management from Config Manager. So as we go through the presentation, we're going to be talking about concepts like workloads and going deep into those. But even before we get that far, once we enable co-management, which is very easy, there is some stuff that lights up straight away, which is really useful. So we're going to talk about that. Point 3 is really important. We're going to do a bit of a pause at that point and have a bit of free conversation around it about the planning. I've worked with customers before who are quite cautious as they go into co-management and like to plan, and other customers who've like all guns blazing, let's move all the sliders and we want to go to the cloud because the cloud is the future and that's where all the cool toys are. But you can hit some problems by doing that if you're not planning properly, and we'd like to spend some time just talking about that. And point 4 on the agenda, we'll talk about the paths to co-management. So a lot of people will be looking to move their existing Config Manager investment, so their Config Manager clients, to realize the cloud value. Okay, that's one part of co-management. But we'll also talk about, okay, so what if we have these clients who are born on the internet and I maybe want to join those into Config Manager? Why would I want to do that? And how do I do that? So we'll cover that. And then point 5 is going to be the nitty gritty. So we're going to get into a lot of detail about workloads. We'll talk a bit about the workloads that we can move across. We'll talk about some of the issues we've seen when moving workloads when you have legacy settings in your environment. So group policy is a classic. If you're setting reg keys manually to do stuff, that can really trip you up. So we'll go deep into that. And then we'll finish off with some Q&A. So we're going to be dipping in and out to Q&A as we go through, but we'll also leave some time at the end as well. And we've got a competition at the end as well to give away some cool prizes. So hang around to the end. Okay, so let's get kicked off here. So what is co-management? Co-management has been around as a concept for a long time now. I think it was Brad Anderson who introduced it quite a few years ago. Very passionate about co-management. And essentially it's a feature that attaches your clients, your Config Manager clients, to the cloud. That was its main purpose when the idea was born. And what Microsoft saw were that people were eager to get to the cloud, connect to the cloud, to Azure AD, to realize the benefits that has, enroll their devices to Intune, but it always seemed very much a lift and shift. Yeah, so I've got Config Manager, I've got a lot of time and real estate invested into the way I've built this, and I've got my clients working exactly the way I want them, but now I want to go to Intune. Yeah, and when a couple of years ago, when everybody was trying to work from home, a lot of people didn't have that cloud infrastructure set up. So co-management kind of addressed that move from traditional on-prem to the cloud in a way that was manageable.
And I think an interesting part about the co-management conversation when it first started, right, was there was a bit of a bad message that went out, right, on the intent. Are we moving to Intune? Is this like our bridge to get there, or are we using this as like a supplemental tool set? And it's really cleared up a lot over time, right? The message mostly seems to be that they're supposed to work in tandem, right? If it works for you, it works for you. But it definitely can be used as a tool to move, or help move. So we try to cover a couple of the gotchas in between, and I think the interesting part too, which we kind of talked about a little bit on one of the other slides, is there's benefits in both directions, right? When your Intune clients, your cloud native clients be co-managed by ConfigMan, and vice versa. So we'll touch a little bit on both directions.
Absolutely, and hopefully as well, from at the end of the webinar, you'll realize that you don't have to do co-management. You can just have an infrastructure in Intune, have Intune built and just natively join your devices to Azure AD and Intune enrolled, and they don't have to touch Config Manager. But there are benefits for doing that. We'll touch on those. Cool. Okay, so this is kind of like a high-level view of what co-management looks like. And when we talk about co-management, we're talking about the agents on the Windows device that control which policy is enforced on the device. So at the bottom here, we have this is our kind of like traditional config manager. You had the config manager client installed on your Windows device, and that would deliver application and policy and all that good stuff we're used to. And then along comes Intune. So Intune communicates with the MDM agent built into Windows. Okay, so you would still have applications and policy coming down and hitting the Windows device from here. And it's like, well, okay, if I'm delivering policy from Config Manager and I'm wanting to deliver policy from Intune, how is that going to look? How is that going to work? Okay. And then you've also had this, well, who's using GPO still? Quite a lot of people. You had GPOs in the mix as well. And like, well, how does that work? If I'm also sending GPOs to my device, how do I have control over that? Okay. And let me just clear that deck. So co-management will address the policy clash that you may have seen between Config Manager and Intune. It doesn't address, anything that's coming from GPO still. So you may be, when you first started looking at Intune, you may be familiar with this policy here, MDM wins over GP. So this was a CSP that you used to set if you wanted your Intune policy to override what you were setting with group policy. That worked to a degree. So especially early on, when the CSPs that are available in Intune weren't always covering every single group policy object that you may have applied to the device. So if we take an example, let's say I've got really complex group policy managing the way Windows updates behaviors on my devices, okay? And then I'm deploying Windows Update for Business policy from Intune as well. Well, the expectation was if I set this CSP, MDM wins over GP, that Intune was suddenly in full control over the experience on that device. And that was true if there was a correlation between the CSP being set and the group policy object. And there wasn't always a marriott between the two. So you would still maybe get some GPOs that were applying because there was not an equivalent CSP to override it. And that would break the Windows Update experience. And I think we've got an example later on, which we can talk about. So at a high level, this is kind of how it works. You've got policy coming from Intune, policy coming from Config Manager and apps. And with the Config Manager client installed, Intune's kind of out of the window, okay? Policy isn't being applied to this device. And so co-management is a way for us to slowly let the different policies come in from Intune so we can slowly migrate that management workload across to Intune.
Yeah, and I think this slide really highlights the importance of the planning aspect of it. Microsoft has made some decent tooling, right? And co-management is part of that tooling to help make that shift a little bit easier and granular, which I think is pretty important because moving some of these workloads can have, some intended and kind of unintended or unexpected, results. So
defo. So one of the questions that always comes up is this tenant attach? And like, no, it's not. You may have heard of the terminology tenant attach before. And the best way to think about the two and to make that discrepancy is tenant attach is connecting your config manager environment to the cloud. And there is value in doing that. So you can expose the devices that you have in config manager via the admin service to Intune the devices would appear in Intune, and there would be some value for doing that. But it's a relationship between config manager and Intune. Co-management is specifically talking about connecting your devices to Intune. If you've got any more thoughts on that, Cody, or
the only thing that comes to mind,
clear?
right, is the little bit you found where you actually have to enable tenant attach now when you go through this process, though, which was previously not a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if we go, like, if I jump across to one of the labs here, let's break into a lab real early on. So we're going to go through this in the slides in a second, but I effectively want to come into administration and cloud services. And this has changed a few times over a few different config manager releases. So I can go to configure cloud attach, and cloud attach is both tenant attach and co-management. Okay, but if I run through this wizard real quick and sign in, okay, I'm just going to go with the defaults. So what's that actually doing? We'll give it a second. Doesn't take long. This could be our first awkward silence. This could take longer than it did in test.
That's all right. It says it's working.
Cool. There you go. So what it's actually done, let's have a look at that. So that is actually going to enable tenant attach and co-management, whereas before you were able to enable co-management on its own. So configure upload, this is tenant attach. So what I'm saying here is upload all devices to Intune by default. It's not uploading devices to Intune, it's exposing them via the admin service so you can see all your devices in Intune. And what that might look like is if I jump into my tenant here, actually, let me go on this box. If I look at my devices in Intune, you can see here, these devices here, like SQL, so that's my SQL server, that's my domain controller. These have all been exposed by the admin service, so I can see them. They're not enrolled into Intune. I can't push policy to them, but there are some options. You know, I do have some things I can do via the admin service. So tenant attach is not something we're going to cover in this webinar, but it's really interesting. A lot of value from doing it. Co-management, like I said, it's a way for us to manage our devices in Intune and create the easy path. So let's just jump back to the slide. I just lost. Here we go. Cool. So the immediate value we get by enabling co-management. So when we say enable co-management, I'm going to flip back a few times. So just let me know if this doesn't come across okay.
Yeah, it looks good.
Cool. So here's one we built earlier. This one has got co-management already configured. So we go to cloud attach, look at the properties. There's a couple of things here. So to be able to manage devices from Intune, we need to enroll the device into Intune. So how does that happen? And we're going to go through some of the prereqs, okay? But the device needs to be enrolled. And as soon as it's enrolled in Intune, we get some features lit up straight away. So I'm going to go through the wizard again later, but when we go into the co-management properties, we do actually have a choice on which devices we want to enroll into Intune as part of co-management. We can enroll all eligible devices, Windows 10 and Windows 11, or we can pilot this and set this to a specific collection if you're not ready to enroll all your devices into Intune. But let's have a look at some of the value you get straight away by doing that. My device is enrolled into Intune. Straight away, I'm going to be able to use conditional access with device compliance. Okay. My device is registered in Azure Active Directory. It's hybrid Azure AD joined, which means I can start looking at device compliance signals. So if my device falls out of compliance because maybe the antivirus is out of date or BitLocker is not enabled, disk isn't encrypted, antivirus doesn't exist on the box, that device will be marked as non-compliant, and I can use my conditional access rules to stop that device accessing my Office 365 services.
So that's something. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
I think the other neat part about this is that little bullet there, include config-man items, configuration items and baselines. So you do actually have the option to include arbitrary baselines in your compliance policies, which makes them incredibly powerful, right? Typically, you're restricted by the growing list, but the list of things that Intune provides you for, or Azure provides you for conditional access. You can actually factor in your baselines, and at that point, the sky's the limit. You can run any PowerShell script you want, or reg check, or file check, anything you want to run to contribute to your compliance, right? Which can make you even more secure, really, if you're being very specific about some maybe security checks or something locally.
Absolutely. It's a massive win. Just get the devices enrolled, even without thinking about moving the workloads. Immediate value, really good. And like Cody said, you don't even have to move a workload. Since Windows 10 1903, you can actually target devices with scripts from Intune without having to move the client app's workload. So really good information there. These decks will be made available afterwards. So if we skip too fast for those who are still learning, then don't worry, we'll share these out. So there's some immediate value for existing config manager clients, but what about devices that are already enrolled into Intune? Because we talked about, and we'll go into more detail, the different paths to co-management. So that would be existing config manager clients enrolling into Intune, but for our internet-born devices, we also see some immediate value. So I've got my device enrolled into Intune. Why would I want to join it back to config man? Why would I want to install the client on it? And for me personally, this is the biggest thing. Okay, so reporting is a story that's still being told in Intune. I think that's fair to say. That's my perspective. It's there and it works, but if I compare it to the type of reporting I can do based on my hardware inventory data in config man, and there's still a little way to go. So for me, enrolling the device into config man by installing the config manager agent, I get that immediate value. The other thing I can do from the Intune perspective is I can install the config manager client from Intune and provision a task sequence. So we can use the provision TS parameter when we install the client on the Intune device. And that's really, really useful.
Yeah, this slide I think is really interesting, right? Because typically when we think of co-management, it's originating from config-man, and you're thinking about extending your config-man environment out there into the cloud. And adding in like some supplemental Intune feature sets but on the flip side, right, there is some value to adding those config-man components to your existing cloud managed devices. There's kind of a lot going on there, though, right? You have to have a config-man environment, which if you've been cloud native, less likely, right? And potentially more cumbersome to implement, right? You may not even have an on-prem infrastructure. So not always a route, but sometimes there's just use cases for it. You may end up in the pure cloud managed scenario, and then you just are struggling to get the data, and you maybe still do have some of those on-prem resources, and this makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something to not dismiss, but there's some legwork there depending on your scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And I felt like I needed to call this last point out as well, because this is really quite powerful. So like Cody mentioned, if you're using configuration items and configuration baselines in config man to understand the compliance of a device, you can actually use that data to mark the compliance of the device in conditional access as well. So we can make use of all of the complex CIs and baselines we have, and we can use that signal to tell whether a device is compliant or not, and then deny access to our Office 365 services by using conditional access. So that's really powerful. Cool. Okay, so if we go back to the slide. So let's spend a few minutes talking about this. Plan. When we talk about co-management, and we're going to go through the workloads in a bit more detail, at a very high level, these are the workloads that we can move to Intune on a gradual basis. So the first step, devices enrolled into Intune, immediate value, excellent. But I want to do some more stuff. So maybe I want to look at moving my compliance across to Intune as well, to leverage those Intune compliance policies. Like we showed you on the previous slide, you can still use config manager signals for your compliance. I don't know if I've got an example in my lab of a baseline, but if you were going to do that,
actually,
sorry,
I was going to ask that actually, if you had one in here.
Yeah, let's have a look. Yeah, I've got a baseline. It's probably not applicable to this, but we've got one. But what we can do when we talk about moving workloads and we say, okay, I want to move the compliance workload and I want to do compliance from Intune, which means everything from config man is going to get ignored. Yeah, so we're controlling which policy gets applied through which agent. We can actually force this policy to still be evaluated when we move the workload across. So if you want to do that, there's a little checkbox on the baseline. That's the one you're looking for.
Yep, and there's two there that are important, right? You've got the top one to say always apply it, but then the bottom one too is your part of compliance policy assessment. That one's going to let you factor baselines into conditional access.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we were looking at conditional access, I can go in here real quick. Actually, I want to go in compliance policies in Intune. It's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, I think the bit of fun that's developed over time is that these workloads are a little bit more true to the name now, right? It's called co-management, and over time, the functionality of these workloads has changed a little bit. They used to be a bit more polarizing, right? It was either Intune or config man in some cases, but nowadays, we'll kind of talk through some of it. Almost every workload is co-management. Both things are able to contribute, but there's a lot of little checkboxes and radio buttons and components that contribute to that.
Defo. And this is what we're talking about. If we still want to pivot and use those signals from config man compliance, we can set that on our compliance policy in Intune. So even if we move the compliance workload, we can still make use of config manager. So that's another great reason to install the config manager client for those internet-born devices. So these are the policies. We're going to jump into Windows Update policies in a lot of detail because that's a subject we love, quite honestly. Endpoint protection, so looking at antivirus policies, BitLocker policies, that kind of thing. Device configuration, so looking at device config from Intune. That's a really bad arrow I just drew with my freehand. Office click to run apps, so where do we want to install Office 365 from, config manager or Intune? Client apps workload, again, we're going to go into more detail later on that as well. But just to call out on this slide that resource access policies was a thing, it was a workload, but it's since not a thing anymore. So that was deprecated in config man 2203. Okay, so what Microsoft is saying now is move that slider, move that workload slider fully across to Intune to get your policies from there. So we're talking about certificates, VPN, Wi-Fi profiles, Windows Hello for Business. I'm just going to dip out this stage just quickly into the lab again, because I mentioned workloads there and sliders, and I'm conscious that we haven't actually shown you that yet.
And Ben, while you've got that, there's a question in the chat that says, but when moving the compliance workload to Intune and then you check off the always apply checkbox, the actual compliance status is still 100% in Intune, or is the config manager compliance just for remediation?
So the compliance of your baselines is considered into your compliance in Intune. So if you have a bad baseline that's not reporting compliance appropriately, that's going to affect your conditional access. Yeah. So you need to be very careful to use your baselines correctly.
Yeah, great. Yeah, perfect. So even the little information tab in Intune compliance shows you that as well. Cool. So what I was just going to jump back into here. So I'm jumping back into code management within the config manager console, and we talked about enabling code management. So it's enabled. I've got it enabled for a pilot collection, so not all devices. But when we talk about workloads, this is what I'm talking about. By default, all of our workloads will be with config manager when we light this thing up. Okay. And specifically with reference to the last slide, resource access policies, you are going to configure those fully from Intune. So it just makes sense to move that slider completely across to Intune. With the other workloads, you don't have to do a big bang approach. You don't have to say for every single device that's enrolled into Intune and has a config manager client, all the policies now going to come from Intune. You can still be gradual in the way you approach that with collections. So they have this concept of pilot Intune. So I can move all of my sliders to pilot Intune for all these different workloads, and then I choose a staging collection for each of those workloads. So for compliance policies, what I'm saying is any device within this collection would get the compliance policy moved across to Intune from Config Manager.
Yeah, and these staging collections are key, really. Microsoft did not have this at first, right? It was kind of on and off. There was just staging for co-management, and then over time they started to break it up, and you could do specific policies. So they really made it easier to migrate and to evaluate these options here, because it was not easy before.
No, this is good. This is good. So and everybody's different. So what I did in my lab for these, so we would have collections for code management. And so when I was ready for specific devices to maybe start getting device configuration from Intune instead of Config Man, then I would add the device to this collection. Pretty straightforward stuff. Once you get to the point where you think you've got all your devices in that pilot Intune phase, then you probably just want to swing that slider all the way across to Intune. And effectively what that's doing, if you remember back to the diagram we showed earlier, you're effectively stopping any of those configurations coming from the Config Manager client. Those configurations will be coming from Intune now. Cool. So planning, this section was all about planning, plan. We talked about using pilot collections when we're moving workloads across to Intune. Absolutely, that's a really good way to dip the toe in the water. But we mentioned this earlier as well, policy conflict. So specifically what we're talking about there is there a matching CSP from Intune? And I'm going to go into more detail later with this as well. And we said, if there's a policy coming from on-prem, whether it's coming from group policy or config manager, and you've got a policy coming from Intune, for Intune to override that, there has to be a matching equivalent on-prem. So the CSP setting you're setting, there must be an equivalent registry key or config manager setting. If it doesn't exist, you can still get policy conflict on the device. So if you're setting registry keys manually, or you've got group policy preferences setting registry keys for Windows updates, and your expectation is that when you move the Windows update workload across to Intune, the Intune's now going to do everything. Well, it will, as long as the CSPs that are coming down will counteract the registry keys you've set. And there are instances, for example, you can disable Windows updates by setting a registry key, and there isn't an equivalent CSP to override that. So you might think updates are coming from Intune, Windows Update for Business, but they're not, because updates are disabled. And we'll cover that again in more detail as we go along. Another thing to call out is existing policy danger. This is something that could trip you up. Okay, so when we talk about planning, you're not going to say, Cody, do you want to speak to this as well?
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit. So certain things when you're managing your clients are more of like a stamp, right? Policy versus preference type stuff. And so some things are going to actually just be hanging around. I think one of the most prevalent ones is going to be some of the Windows updates bits and pieces. So what you'll see sometimes when people are doing these migrations is trying to migrate like over their Windows Update workload. Let's use Microsoft and Windows Update for Business. But there's been various articles and suggestions over time, and then some config man settings where you end up with Windows updates, disabled or don't reach out to Microsoft type stuff. And then once you've moved your management into Intune, it can even be a little bit more problematic to find those devices. So you can blanket remediate, but I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to be aware of some of those existing policies that you have that are going to clash and may not be overridden by Intune.
Defo. And one that I see catching a lot of people out is the client apps workload. That's a fairly easy workload to move, and this is a fairly unique workload actually, which we'll speak more on as well. So when you move the client apps workload, effectively what you're saying, it's not a this or that. It's not config manager or Intune. It's okay, I'm now going to allow applications to come from Intune to hit my device. So Win32 apps. effectively, when you move that slider, the Intune management extension is installed if there's a application being targeted to the device, and that device could start receiving applications from Intune, you know. And so if you've got an application targeted to all devices or a specific Azure AD group, if your client that's enrolling into co-management suddenly falls in scope of the Azure AD group, it becomes a member, maybe you're synchronizing collections to Azure AD groups, then that device will suddenly receive the app. So I've seen cases where co-management is enabled, the client apps workload is moved across, and then suddenly all these applications just start coming down on the device. And sometimes they're not applications, sometimes there's scripts bundled up as Win32 apps, and suddenly it's like a free-for-all. So that might catch you out. So absolutely plan it. You know, when that device gets moved across to co-management, will it suddenly fall in scope of an Azure AD group that has an application targeted to it?
I do see a couple people ask this one. So with regards to servers and co-management, so your server clients are not going to process the co-management configuration baseline. So the way that the co-management actually works is there's actually hidden configuration baselines that get created and deployed out. And that's how they're actually flipping your workloads on your clients. There's just baselines that get deployed out that you don't directly manage like you do traditional baselines, and they exclude servers. So even if you happen to have servers in these pilot collections, or if you flip it over to all, you're not going to really see any adverse effects on your server. That shouldn't be any issue.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely spot on. So when the configuration comes down,
Ben, I was answering that question in chat, and the way to think about it, because you can generalize this, not just servers. Like when you slide those sliders and you pick between a workload being config-man or in Intune, what will happen is that policy just happens when a client is both config-man and Intune managed. And if it's not, then everything still stays config-man managed. And to what Cody said, because servers cannot be enrolled in Intune, those sliders never will matter.
Yeah, spot on. And to Cody's point as well, there is a policy that comes down when you enable co-management. The device will get this policy. You can track it coming down in the logs. And we're going to look at this more as well. But if I quickly just jump out to a client and
to add to that too, since you're setting up tenant attach as a part of this, the servers will show up on the Intune side, but they won't accept any policy, and you can't deploy anything or do anything to them as well.
I think they show up differently, don't they? There's a different.
They do.
Yeah.
They'll show up as like server OS, but yeah, you won't be able to push anything out to them.
And the part that's different to them is, well, let's see. It's because they're not enrolled, right? They show up, devices when you tenant attach show up as enrolled in Intune or not enrolled in Intune. And servers could never be enrolled in Intune. You can also have client operating systems not enrolled in Intune. And in either case, you can still do some UI actions on those. Like you could force a policy sync and things, because it will reach down and use admin service to trigger it on the config-man side. So it's really that they can't be enrolled, and that's how they'll show up. Yeah, like Ben is showing here.
Yeah, so like we said earlier, these are servers that I have in my tenant, so I can look on my SQL box. It might look like it's enrolled in Intune, but it's not. It's never going to receive policy. But there are some actions I can do via the admin service, which is pretty cool. Cool. So we do have a load of actions we can do. So this is pretty cool stuff. So definitely go and have a look at tenant attach. It's really cool. Okay, let's jump back into the deck here. Parts of the co-management. So let's dive into this a bit more. So how do we get to co-management? Well, we said we can either get existing config manager devices enrolled into Intune. That's one path, existing config manager clients. The other option we have is to take those internet-born devices, Azure AD joined, Intune enrolled, native cloud. We can still install the config manager client on those devices to realize some value, which we mentioned in the beginning. So things like, do I want to provision a task sequence through autopilot? Some people do. Do I want to get some really rich hardware inventory so I can do some really cool reporting on compliance? Absolutely. It's another reason for doing that. And we're going to talk through both as well. Some of the prereqs, we're not going to deep dive all the prereqs, especially for existing devices, because we're going to talk about hybrid Azure AD join. There's a lot of moving parts, but hopefully these decks, which we'll share, will be a prompt for you to go and look into those areas in more detail. Okay, so for an existing config manager device, it does need to be hybrid Azure AD joined. So there's a lot of moving parts there. You're going to need Azure AD Connect on-prem, which is essentially going to synchronize those device identities up to Azure. You're going to need a license. You're going to need Intune licenses for your users. You need to configure hybrid Azure AD join. Ignore that, I'll cross it out. There's like a spelling mistake there. So configure hybrid Azure AD join with Azure AD Connect. We need to set a client agent setting for hybrid Azure AD join as well. And we can configure auto enrollment of devices. That will happen automatically for your config manager devices. You can set a GPO to enroll devices into Intune, but it's not necessary. Config manager does a really good job of it using the Azure AD device token. It's very quick, very seamless, and it scales really well across a large organization. So if config manager is enrolling thousands of devices, it will stagger it so that it doesn't all hit your tenant at once and everybody gets like a graph denied.
And I think one thing that I think is important is it is a long list, but in a lot of organizations, some of these prerequisites are already in place, right?
Yeah.
If you already have some sort of Azure presence and you do have an on-prem domain, there's a decent chance you likely already have some of the top ones, right? You probably already have Azure AD Connect or some sort of syncing configuration going on between them. Like some of these will be in place. You just need to button up the parts that aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. So for hybrid Azure AD join, I've just called this out because I've just seen it missed a couple of times. So your device will reach out to the internet. So if you've got proxies, just bear that in mind because the system context reaches out. That's something I've seen people trip up with before. To configure co-management, you'll need global admin. When you're setting up hybrid Azure AD join, there is a service connection point created in Azure Active Directory, which your clients can use to find your tenant. So you need an enterprise admin to do that. You'll need a config manager administrator with all roles in scope to set up co-management as well. And one thing that also gets missed from time to time is in Intune, your users will need to be in scope to enroll those devices. So set the NDM user scope in Intune. So I'm not going to spend too long on those because like Cody said, you've probably already got this stuff configured. So effectively, when hybrid Azure AD join happens, your devices will look at the SCP configured in Azure Active Directory to know where to go to register themselves. I'm just calling that on the slide. And if you're having issues with devices enrolling into co-management, probably the first thing to do is check whether it's hybrid Azure AD joined. So you can run dsreg cmd/status, and that will tell you whether the device is Azure AD joined. So in this example, my device is Azure AD joined and it's domain joined, which means it's hybrid Azure AD joined. And you can see that event also in the event log, event 306. So once your device is hybrid Azure AD joined and it's in scope to be enrolled into Intune, so in the co-management settings, that device either falls within a pilot collection for Intune enrollment, or you've got it set to all devices, so all devices enroll into Intune. You can track that as well in the co-management handler.log file. This changed recently, and I haven't really dug into it. So before, there used to be a scheduled task that was created under enterprise management that would enroll your device. And I don't know if you know this or not, DGen, but I think the config manager client is now responsible for the enrollment. We see an event created, but we no longer see a scheduled task created to do that enrollment.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's just calling some APIs locally now.
Cool. So, like we said before, if you're enrolling a load of devices, that is staggered across the environment, and you can track that as well in the co-management handler.log file. The other thing config man does is uses the Azure AD device token. So you can, I'm not going to speak a lot to this, but you can enroll devices to Intune using a group policy, but you can't use the device token. You have to use a user token. So the user logging into the device has to have a valid Intune license. and their token is used to enroll the device into Intune, but you need a user logged in to do that. Why Config Manager is so great at doing it is because it will use the device token to do the enrollment, and then the first user to log into the device after it's enrolled will become the primary user, the owner of the device. So enrollment can happen without a user being present. That's really quite neat.
Kind of an interesting question, worth mentioning. Somebody actually asked if co-management's compatible with GCC high tenants. As far as I know, yes. I want to say it was a few years ago they added it. I'll see if I can find the docs. But yeah, as far as I know, GCC and co-management is a thing.
GCC, Azure Public, and China as well, I believe, valid for co-management. Cool. And the other thing you might want to track when the device is enrolling as well, that it is a fake user that does the enrollment, even though it's the device token, and you can track that in the event log. So the device management enterprise event log, you'll see foo user actually do the enrollment for you. And that is also trackable in the registry as well. So HKey local machine software, Microsoft enrollments, there'll be a GUID. It's not the same for everybody. It will change. But if you look through here, you will see that enrollment information. A couple of things to point out here is, if Zoom it works, I can see here that Config Manager did the enrollment with this foo user at, and the information here is your tenant ID. So that all lines up. That's good for tracking enrollments. So there's a few moving parts to get an existing client enrolled. Not too difficult though, because like we said, Azure AD Connect is probably installed and configured and synchronizing your users and devices. So for your internet-born clients, what do they need? So these are your Azure AD joined Intune enrolled devices. Well, they're going to need line of sight to Config Manager somehow. Okay, you're going to install the client, and it can be a bootstrap client, but ultimately it's going to need to talk to the management point at least. So we need line of sight. That can either happen, and this is normally the preferred way, via a cloud management gateway. It's not the only way, but it's a really easy way to get your internet devices communicating on-prem. If you're still using a VPN, people are, that's just my dry dad humor coming across there. Hands up if you're still using a VPN. But you can have a VPN, and you can actually have, and people do this, you can have internet-born devices that are just connected to the internet. They don't roam the internet, so that's valid as well. You also need to make sure that those devices are able to authenticate to your management point. Okay, so do you have HTTPS enabled on your management point? Does your internet-born device have the valid client certificate to authenticate? Are you using eHTTP in ConfigMan, or are you authenticating with the Azure AD device, with the Azure AD token of the user? We went through a lot of detail on this on the previous webinar when we were talking about cloud management gateways. So if you haven't seen that one already, definitely go on YouTube and review that, because that goes through these different authentication methods. Really useful. So for internet-born devices, we're going to need to install the Config Manager client, and the old way of doing that was to use what they used to call a bootstrap client, and effectively it still is. But you'd create a Win32 app or a line of business app, you know, with the CCM setup file, and you deploy that to your devices. The only issue with that, issue is probably a strong word. Like let's think of the scenario. So I've got my Intune enrolled device, and I'm installing the Config Manager client. Yeah, so that device already has potentially Intune policy applied to it because it was born on the internet. But let me think of another scenario. So maybe I'm just going through autopilot, yeah, and my device doesn't have any policy on it, and I'm deploying a line of business application or Win32 app to install the Config Manager client. The Config Manager client installs, but also through that device provisioning phase, I'm probably also getting policy and apps coming down from Intune. So your expectation could be that your co-management setting is saying everything comes from Config Manager, but the internet-born device is receiving policy. So until the Config Manager client is installed and blocking those workloads, you could end up with policy and apps that maybe you weren't expecting. So there's a really cool way to address it, and it's not to use a Win32 app or a line of business app. It's to use, there's a new feature that's been there quite a few months now to install the config manager client on the devices. To do that, you're going to need to go into the co-management settings, go onto the enablement tab, and grab your CCM setup command line that we're going to need. Okay, so go and grab that. And then when we pop over to Intune, we can go to Windows Enrollment, and there's co-management settings there. This will actually install the config manager client, and it installs it in such a way that the workloads are blocked. Okay, we're not going to get those Intune workloads coming down. The config manager client will be installed in the device setup phase first, and potentially blocking those other workloads coming from Intune until the co-management flags have a chance to do their thing and work out which policy it should be applying to the device. So this is the much easier, much better way to deploy the config manager client. The CCM setup command line you grab from your co-management settings, you just paste into here and target that to a group. There is a setting in here as well. You can override the workloads you've got set in config manager and force everything to come from Intune. There are scenarios that you may want to do that. That's cool. So this is the much better way. There's a lot of websites out there that tell you to use a line of business app or a Win32 app, but they're fairly old articles. This is the new way. This is what the cool kids do. Yeah. Well, I'm just going to do a quick pause to see if there's any questions that have come through that we might want to call out.
I know one I'm seeing is device load and enrollment the same thing, or are they separate?
Device upload and enrollment.
I believe they're saying tenant attach and enrollment.
Yeah, sorry, we're skimming over tenant attach a lot, and maybe we're not like explaining the difference real well. When you set up co-management, by default, if you go with the default settings, tenant attach is enabled to upload all devices. So if I was to bin this off and start it again.
At the high level, right? Tenant attach is your configuration manager server and environment being attached to your tenant, to Intune, right? And so we're going to get additional back and forth conversation there. They can talk to each other, and that's where you can that's where we see those server OSs come in, right? We've uploaded the list of devices and we can see a server OS, so we can do config-man actions because of that tenant attach. But when you have co-management, you actually have the device enrolled in two different places. It's got configuration manager client on there. It's talking back to config-man, but it also is registered and actually enrolled in your Intune tenant or your Azure tenant, and then it's enrolled in Intune. So upload versus enroll, I would say upload is really that tenant attach component. Whereas enrollment is actually enrolled in Intune and being managed by it or co-managed by it.
Right, and as Cody says, the simplest way to think about it is tenant attach or upload is config-man server sharing its data up to the cloud and letting you populate some UI there that you can do actions on that send those actions down to config-man, and then it triggers the actions. Where co-management is now the client's being managed directly by both Intune and by config-man, and it's not either or. Your clients can be in either of these states or both. You can have a client that's only tenant attached, you can have one that's only co-managed, or you can have one that's tenant attached and co-managed. And then it's really, are the servers talking together, or are the clients both being managed by both? And there's different functionality in each of those sets.
Cool. Absolutely. So we got some good content to rattle through, so I'm gonna pick up the pace again. So when we talk about moving workloads, we've already talked about the sliders. We can move them across gradually to specific pilot collections, or we can move them across in their entirety. We also called out that resource access policies is no longer a workload that we can move. It should just be moved completely across to Intune. So how does this thing work under the hood? So going a little bit deeper, when we talk about workloads, how does config-man know which workloads we should be enforcing on the client? And so it does this with something called a capability. So each workload has a representative capability number. And there's a calculation that goes on We'll talk to it in a bit as well about how that works. That determines what the device should be doing. Should it be getting its workload from Intune or Config Manager? And you can actually see the policy hitting the client as well. You can go into Config Manager properties in the control panel applet and have a look at the configurations tab. And we showed this earlier. So this device is quite clear that I've got it's set to enroll into Intune, and I've got the Windows Update policy moved across for this client. So I can look in the co-management handler log file to see that information as well. So that's in the CCM logs folder, co-management handler. This is the thing you want to be keeping an eye on to understand what's going on. And you'll see these lines here like merging workload flags. So there's a workload that has a representative value of 8197, 8213, 8193. So what do these actually mean? Cool. So we can see the workload that's currently enforced on the client by looking on the general tab on the. So this one is 8213. So I don't know what that means. Which workload does that mean? Is it Windows updates? Is it client apps? Well, there's an easy way to work this out. We're just going to call out these capability values and what they mean in Config Manager 2111. So hopefully you're fairly up to date. So when you're looking at these values, this is kind of what they mean. So 8193 co-management enabled, compliance policies 2, resource access policies 4. There was a split fairly recently for endpoint protection, so these numbers jumped out massively. So how do these numbers get merged together to actually work out what the overall workload should be? And Cody's the maths brain on the call.
No, not quite.
But anybody who's good at maths and you think of bitwise operations, you can look at the binary representation for that decimal value. And so we've called those out here on this slide, and we're not going to spend a load of time on this. But these are the binary representations. So if I want to do a bitwise operation to maybe see what two of them together would be. Let's take an example. So if I've enabled co-management on a client, I know that 8193 means co-management is enabled, and I know the capability number for compliance is 2. So if I merge these together, I just do a bitwise operation, and I can kind of have a look through here. If I'm working top to down, I'm looking at the difference between these different binary values, and I can see here that I've got 1 in this column, and if I come all the way to the end, I've got 1 in this column and 1 in this column. So the binary representation of that merge is 8195. Cool, good bit of maths. We won't dwell on that. But you can work out this stuff much easier. You can use PowerShell. I'm not encouraging everybody to go away and learn how to do bitwise operations, but we can do some cool stuff with PowerShell using enums and flags. So let me jump across to client number 3. So if I run this very simple PowerShell code here, okay, so I've basically set the values in here, and if I want to do a really simple, let's run this and run the function.
And these have definitely changed over time. You know, there used to be less of them. Some of the numbers have just changed. Some of them have been combined. So definitely an interesting thing to even try to keep track of, right? Usually it's set it and forget it. Hopefully you never even need to look at these numbers.
So like on this client here, I know that 8213 is my capability number. So if I just put this to my function, get workload 8213, it's telling me what workloads are on this client. So resource access policies and Windows update policies. Well, I know that's true because if I go and look at my co-management settings, you can see here my workload sliders, resource access policies is all across. So yeah, that's true. My Windows update policies are set to pilot Intune. So my client is going to have to be in that pilot collection, and I can double check that. So BBW11-3 is in the Windows update workload collection. So that rings true. And you can do some really cool stuff with these enums. You can say, we've got another one here for get all workloads. So if I run this, I've got the link to this in the deck as well, if you want to go and grab this code. If I do get all workloads, we can just pop out all the possible combinations you can have with code management. So you can use this as a real handy little reference. So if your workload is 12541, you can see that you've got all of these workloads moved across to the client. I've done a really bad job of underlying that, but you can do some cool stuff with code. So those capabilities are really useful to understand as the client comes into scope for a new workload. You'll see in the code management handler log file these capabilities get merged. So that's something good to keep an eye out for. So I've called out on the slide here. I've done a blog on that, so if you want to go and have a look at that into more detail and look at the code behind that, you're more than welcome. So there's some, like I said before, there's some funky stuff done in 2111 with the split and the capabilities. You can dive into, I'm not pulling apart Microsoft code here, but you can use something like .peek to have a look at the DLLs and look at how these flags are actually worked out by the client. And you can look at how the splits are done and the capability values in code. That's quite interesting. But there was a funny split done for endpoint protection, so I'm not too sure what's going to come in the future for that. We used to just have endpoint security was capability value 32, but then it was split out. And my feeling is that we may be going to see a separate workload come in the future, possibly for BitLocker. I don't know. I've got no insight into that, but there's some cool things happening for sure.
Actually, well, we're on apps. I thought that was going to be updates. There is a good question though. If we move patch management to Intune, what are the options for deploying drivers and BIOS updates? So that is one of the scenarios that you might want to move to, Intune for managing your updates. And you don't have to exclusively manage updates with Intune. You do have some scan sources options, which we'll touch on a little bit here if we have time. So yes, you can deploy drivers and BIOS from Microsoft and Windows Updates for Business while still managing the device with ConfigMan. So that is a scenario you can start to look into.
Yeah, definitely. So we said we're going to pull out some notes from the field, like some of the things we've seen when moving workloads. So you can choose where your notifications come from. That's useful. There's a client setting, so you can choose whether notifications come from Software Center or the company portal. So we're looking here at the client apps workload. So if I go into my code management and just call the workload out specifically. So client apps. So if you remember back to the beginning, when we spoke about client apps, we talked about suddenly bringing apps in scope from Intune. So we're not saying only apps from Intune can come in. We're saying applications can come in from Config Manager and Intune, which is why you maybe need to think and plan that through carefully. Because if you're deploying, let's say, third-party updates from Config Manager, and you're also deploying third-party updates from Intune, which is really easy to do, you're suddenly going to maybe have that device, if it's in the Azure AD group and the collection to get third-party updates, getting updates coming from two different locations at once. So which one will apply? I don't know. Depends on a lot of moving parts. But how is that going to affect your compliance reporting? If you've got apps installing from Intune, the same apps installing from Config Manager, you're doing your compliance reporting in Config Manager, but it's installed from Intune. How does that look? So that's something that you should be thinking about as well. So for client apps specifically, when the workload is moved to Config Manager, we're talking about Company Portal here specifically. So Company Portal, you'll only see Config Manager apps in the Company Portal. So here's an example of the Company Portal. I would only see my Config Manager apps in here, and you can actually click on the application and you'll see, if we give it a second, We'll see the source for the application, whether it's Config Manager or Intune. Embarrassing silence.
It's thinking about it.
It's thinking.
Move to the cloud, they said. It'll be faster.
Mm-hmm.
It's a cloud minute. It'll be fine. You're doing well, Firefox. We're patient. There we go. So you want to click on additional information, and I'm actually probably just going to call this out, and I think I've got it in the deck. Let me just check forwards. Do I have this in the deck? Yeah, I did have it in the previous slide. So I did call out already. So the management service is Config Manager. If the app comes from Intune, if you've moved the client app's workload across, you'll see whether the app has come from Intune. So that's really cool. You can't actually stop the Config Manager apps hitting the device. You can't prevent them from being shown in the company portal. So if you don't want Config Manager apps to be seen in the company portal, let's say you're using a CMG and it's costly for you to install applications over the CMG, then just think about not deploying it to that collection. So you can synchronize your Config Manager collections to Azure AD groups, and you can maybe start looking at how you use excludes on those Azure AD groups, on how you're targeting your apps. So that's a really good way to control where your app source is coming from. Okay, let's move on. Office click to run apps. If you've installed Office from Config Manager, or you've got your own on-prem way of doing stuff, you may have, in your XML file when you installed Office, you could have set the Office management com to true. And what you're doing there is you're saying that all my updates are going to come from Config Manager. Well, by moving workload sliders across, you're not really turning that off. Your clients are still expecting for Office updates to come from Config Manager. So that's maybe one thing you need to think of as you move workloads across to Intune. Like if your devices are suddenly going to go off the network, but the Office management com is set to true, then they're not going to get updates unless they've got line of sight to Config Manager. So that's something to think about. You can retrospectively go and switch that off. There's a registry key you can change. A lot of the time, it's maybe cleaner to think about reinstalling Office with a different XML file where Office Management Com isn't enabled. I've got a couple of links there. There is a proactive remediation you can run to switch the Office Management Com off, but it might be cleaner just to reinstall Office with that switched off. I'm not really convinced on which way is best. You choose.
Because we're on this workload, someone did say, under the Office apps workload, is there a chance it will change the architecture or channel of an existing install? So it shouldn't, right? But it's up to you because you're deploying the software, right? You're going to go and create Office apps inside of Intune, and you're going to deploy them. So it could change it if you deploy something that doesn't match up with what you wanted. Now, updates, no, right? Updates are updates. It's just it's supposed to just update your existing Office install. But I think this plays into the conversation that Ben's really tried to emphasize as part of the planning, right? Potentially, you may have deployments of these new Office installs that are out there in Intune, and then you flip your client's co-management workload for Office, and they happen to be in scope of these groups. Yeah, you may see some unintended consequences.
Yeah, for sure. This is one I've seen a few times where Office just isn't updating, and it's simply because you've got Office Management Com enabled. So definitely have to think about that. Okay, so
people that say their company portal is slow, I have no solution or advice for you. I'm sorry.
Well, it also depends on what do you mean by slow. Apps not showing up right away, or a quick restart of that Intune management extension can get things going a little bit quicker sometimes.
Yeah, that's true, right? If you do have, if you think something's policy related, right? Oh, I deployed this app and I haven't seen it for 2 hours. Couldn't hurt to restart the Intune management extension. But in terms of just the UI loading, welcome to the cloud.
And as far as how to restart that, just go to services and you'll see Microsoft Intune management extension as an option, and just either stop, start, or restart.
Yeah, I've not experienced that specifically, apart from now on the webinar where it was slow to resolve the application. But it depends on what the IME is doing. If you've got a ton of apps targeted to the device and it's polling through all those apps, looking at detection methods, and it's busy, then that can cause things to go slow. So, okay, Windows updates. So this is a favorite of everybody's. So we have had some experience on, what happens when we move the Windows update workload across to Intune. Generally, it just works and it's nice. Okay, that's the general feeling here. So this is some of the things that you might see as that happens. So we can look at what a registry may look like before the workload is moved across. Okay.
I do see we have a note. Someone actually asked, what is the Intune cache server and how can it be used to speed up app delivery? So when you're working with Intune, your cache server is effectively just Microsoft, right? You're going to hit the Microsoft CDN, the content delivery networks, to get your content, but there are some bits and pieces that are going to help, probably without you even doing anything. So natively, those Win32 apps are going to use delivery optimization, which is P2P, right? And not just peer-to-peer, though. It can do, well, it is all peer-to-peer. The scope of it can vary, right? You can configure delivery optimization to say, oh, only this subnet, only this. There's actually a few different ways you can do it. You can do like collections, you can do this subnet, you can do like not on the internet. There's a few of them. And so that's going to be your, kind of cache. Additionally, if you want, there is caching. If you have config-man and you're doing co-management, you can have a delivery optimization cache server on-prem as well. Your distribution point can hold that role, and it'll be a middleman. It'll be a cache server for delivery optimization. So there are some options.
Cool. Thanks, Cody. I think I dropped out for a second. I do apologize.
It's okay. I just started rambling about something.
You're good. So we were just talking about Windows updates. So typically when config manager policy, so your client settings are saying that your clients are going to be enabled for software updates. This is like a typical registry that you might see. Okay. So just recently, there's been some new keys brought in for scan policy, scan source. So you might see these and wondering what they are. So this is the new thing. The disabled dual scan has been around for years and caused a lot of confusion. So by default, disabled dual scan is enabled, which doesn't make sense. But that effectively stops the client from scanning Windows Update. Or it just forces it to scan one source. So this is what a client may look like when it's getting updates from your software update point, default client settings. So when we move the workload, how will that change? Well, here's like a typical workload move. So we can see in the code management log file that before we didn't have Windows Update workload enabled, but then we suddenly brought the client into scope to get Windows updates, moved across to the Windows Update service. And so we see the capabilities change in the log file. And then we'd expect the registry keys to then change as well, which dictates the behavior of the Windows Update agent on that device. You can run a very simple command just to see who the authoritative Windows Update service is on the box. So this is probably going to change if you run it today on your client that's getting updates from WSUS. You'll probably see this as the Windows Server Update Service, but that will change. So that's quite a cool test to do to understand what's the authoritative source for Windows updates. Okay, so on a Windows 10 client, once we move the workload across, your registry keys will change. So your scan source keys will change to 0, which means those workloads will be coming from the Windows Update service. Okay, disabled dual scan is also switched off, which means dual scan is enabled. So historically, what that's always meant to us config admins is I'm going to be scanning the Windows Update service for my Microsoft updates, but I'll still be scanning WSUS for my third-party updates. Okay, that's always been the way, and that's been really cool. We're going to start to see disabled dual scan phased out. So disabled dual scan isn't a thing for Windows 11, okay? And we're seeing it replaced with scan source. So keep an eye out for announcements from Microsoft on that. And Aria Kali, if you're not following her on Twitter, definitely follow her. She's got some awesome information to this point. So keep an eye on that. We can see this is what I've done in the lab earlier. I'm not going to show it live because I'm conscious of the time we have, which is why I have a slide. But after the workload was moved to Windows Update, so my policy was coming from Windows Update for Business, Intune, I was still able to scan third-party updates against WSUS. So that's pretty cool. And this was an update that came through. On Windows 11, it's pretty much the same story. Same registry keys are changed once you move the workload to Windows Update, Intune. But we know that dual scan is not supported on Windows 11. Okay, it's something that's going away. I think it's really only an issue if you're trying to disable dual scan, so update deferrals. I think that's when it becomes an issue. It's interesting, actually, on Windows 11, I'd be really curious, and maybe we can see this on the Q&A later. There are some different behaviors with different config manager versions, different Windows versions on the overall result of what happens with updates once you move the workload. Okay, because dual scan isn't a thing anymore. Scan source is a thing now. Different Windows versions, different flavors, different config manager flavors do slightly different things, and I've been hearing different results from the community on things that work and things that don't work. So we are waiting for more clarity from Microsoft on the expected registry keys and expected behavior. So let's watch this space on that. But I did in the lab, I did see when I'd done an update scan, it did still contact my Windows Update server. So it contacted my software update point via my CMG in my lab and was able to see that there was a missing third-party update. So it's getting Microsoft updates from Microsoft, third-party updates from WSUS. Now, we're not saying it's probably interesting to call out here that you don't have to get third-party updates from WSUS. Okay, you can. You maybe, if you're moving workloads to Intune or the Windows Update service, you may be also starting to think on, should you be moving your third-party updates out to Intune as well? And you can absolutely do that. It's a Win32 app. So that might be something worth thinking about as well. I don't know if you've got any more thoughts on that as well, Cody, on like any pros or cons on using like your software update point via CMG versus deploying the update via Win32 app.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're just dealing with a little bit of infrastructure questions, right? Do you, if you still have a software update point, if you're still managing updates internally, maybe you still have your updates for your servers being handled internally with WSUS as a software update point, and you have a CMG. If that's all there, maybe you have processes, you've got ADRs, you've got that granular control and reporting. Right, use it. That's okay, right? You don't have an obligation to move to Windows Updates for Business. You don't have to move this workload. It's just there if you want to, right? I saw a question which is kind of interesting. If we move Windows Updates to Intune, what's the approval process so that we don't approve garbage for our clients? So kind of interesting, right? I guess, what do you mean by garbage? Because with Intune, with Windows Update for Business, you got like the Microsoft updates. It'd be like you reaching out to Microsoft. And that can include things like drivers and BIOS, but generally speaking, it's your .NET framework, your Edge updates, your security updates, that sort of thing. And you do have some control, right? You've got rings and you've got things you can turn on and off and delay. But
you can force only a specific feature update to be available, so you can kind of stop at that point and still get security updates and things like that too. But it's kind of an all or nothing type approach.
It is a little bit more on and off, but I mean, in terms of garbage, it's the same updates you'd be getting from ConfigMan.
Cody, I think that's a statement that about once a quarter Microsoft ships a bad patch, and so there's not an approval flow for that. So I think that's that question.
Yeah, and if that's the case, right, that's on like your rings, right? You still need to do your testing. You do still need to control it. There's similar tool sets in a lot of ways. Maybe they're not as granular, right? You don't have ADRs in your collections necessarily, but you do have some flexibility that I think gets you where you need to be in a lot of orgs.
I do think this is a big thing to think about. A decision point is if your end goal is 100% cloud and uninstall ConfigMan, then you have to figure this out. If your end goal is code management and use features from both Intune and ConfigMan, then now you have a question of, okay, when do I want to move patching? And the answer to that is, when does reporting in Intune and Windows Update for Business and these slightly less control over patching meet your needs? And if it doesn't meet your needs and you need the detailed reporting and detailed scheduling, then keep it in Intune or keep it in ConfigMan.
Yep.
And if you can live without that complexity, then move it to Intune. But other than the more detailed reporting, a little more real time on control and actions and scheduling, fidelity and per patch approval, that's the big difference between Intune and ConfigMan for patching.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd echo the same thoughts. That simplicity is a word I would use. You know, if you like to keep things simple, WIFB is awesome. There are some cool features as well, like expedite updates. That's pretty cool. Like if a 0-day comes out and you want to expedite an update out really quickly, that's a really simple way to do that from WIFB. So yeah, it comes down to your needs. Absolutely. And the great thing about code management is you can test this stuff. It's not an all or nothing. This is the great thing, you know. Okay, I want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm just going to rattle through these last couple of slides. Some legacy settings can prevent Windows updates from working, full stop. If you have these registry keys deployed today, either via group policy preference or something you're setting with a CI or baseline, this will break Windows Update, okay? So keep an eye out for these. And there is a real simple way to do it, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but you can understand how widespread those breaking registry keys are across your organization. I did a blog post on it. You're welcome to go and have a look. But we can use proactive remediations to collect the state of a device, you know, registry keys that are in place that shouldn't be, bring that into log analytics, and then use workbooks to visualize that data. So I've shared the link on there if you want to have a look at that stuff. That might give you a snapshot of any really bad settings across your state that you shouldn't have. It's a really cool workbook as well. We'll also show you, Ari did a great TechNet post on the Windows Update keys you shouldn't be setting. So there are some registry keys that you don't have to set because they do nothing. And so this workbook can also pick those as well and just let you know where you're setting policy where you don't need to. But more importantly, it'll show you where you're actually breaking stuff by doing that. This is probably the last slide I want to add in today. I thought it is worth adding in. It's not really code management, but you know, you may have heard the buzzword auto patch from Microsoft. So from a code management point of view, there are some workloads you do have to move across to Intune if you want to use the Microsoft auto patch feature. So Windows Update policies, device configuration, and Office click to run apps. They're 3 workloads that you would have to move. And again, there's a link there if you want to read more on that. But hopefully I've left 10 minutes for some Q&A. How are we doing for time?
Got a little bit of time here. I know there's one that's come up a couple times. A couple of people have asked about it, and I didn't know this. So if you have hybrid Azure AD joined devices, it is not supported to go from autopilot into co-management. You have to have an Azure AD joined only device to transition directly from autopilot into a co-managed device, and that's on the list of requirements for autopilot enrollment. So that's a really good call out.
But to be clear as well, because some people are getting this confused, it is totally supported outside of autopilot to start in ConfigMan and end up in hybrid AADJ, because that's the only way for co-management sliders to work unless you're going to re-image the machine when you move the slider.
Absolutely, yeah. Hybrid Azure AD join and co-management do work together. You can do that, but very specifically, you can't go autopilot, hybrid Azure AD joined, co-manage. That cannot be done. You can do it after the fact, right? You can autopilot and then do the rest of the steps afterwards, but that's not a very smooth process, but it will work.
For sure. Were there any other good questions in there that we feel we could share out loud and talk about?
I don't know. There's one that's kind of interesting. It's a little bit out there, but what's the main selling point of Intune, right? What will my management understand? It looks like a lot of effort, and it looks like some restrictions. I don't know, Ben, you might have a better answer for this one than me. Selling point for Intune.
It's, you know, like it for me, it kind of feels like I remember back to when I was an admin, and I was an admin like during COVID, and I really everybody wanted to go home with their laptops, and I wasn't quite ready with where we were with our story, with code management and config manager, and VPNs were really tricky. Really expensive as well on the WAN. Yeah, so everybody connecting over a VPN, pulling over content like applications policy, like killing the WAN bandwidth of my. And there's all these complications I had to work out. And if I'd have worked that story out already, and I could actually connect my devices natively to the internet, that would have solved a lot of problems for me. So for me, code management would have been really useful at that time. So I could have got a lot of my policy applications, especially coming from Intune. Like even if you spin up a CMG to serve your applications out, there's still a cost there for you to do that. So the ingress into CMG is free, but the egress from your clients is going to cost you. If you're deploying applications directly from Intune, you don't have that cost. It's just whatever the bandwidth, you know, whatever the internet connection is, where that client is, that's the cost, you know.
But I think they're also asking like just in Intune in general, not necessarily, you know, co-management. I mean, I know at least for me at my previous org, the number one thing was autopilot. I no longer needed to have devices shipped to the office and unbox them, image them, box them back up, send them out. I could have my vendor directly send the device straight to whoever's house or whatever office needed them, and they were good to go. Just one of the small benefits there.
Yeah, I'd say like config manager and Intune, they solve the same problems and they solve different problems. You know, it's really just looking at what you're doing, and everybody does things differently. You know, I'd also say that you know you're paying for Intune anyway. If you've got a config man license, an Intune license, you know you can use the service.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just also looking through the questions as well. If there's anything that jumps out, I can see our moderators have been hard at work answering questions. Kudos to you. Is there anything else, Andrew and Jake, that we should call out before we get rid of some swag?
Yeah, being able to deploy. Yeah, I mean, with the Intune stuff too, right? Someone just mentioned being able to deploy apps without being on a VPN or having a CMG. I mean, it's in general, right? You're pure internet based. Like since I've worked here at Patch My PC, not a single one of my computers has like been at the office, right? We used to actually have a domain. We had a domain and a config man environment, and we had a CMG. And we used it, but like all of my devices are all cloud native, right? They just ship to my house, and I'm able to connect them, and I'm able to do everything that I can do. So I mean, it's great. There's a lot of appeal there, but you know, you lose some things in some areas. You lose a little bit of reporting at the moment in some cases. You can supplement it though. There's a lot of data there. It's just not always presented the best way. You know, there's definitely some convenience. There's also a lot of black boxes. Config man admins, I think, are really comfortable digging in, reading logs, and being able to follow, right? Oh, hardware inventory didn't work, and then you can go check the logs on the client, the logs on the server, the inboxes, the status message. You can check everything, right? And in Intune, it's like, oh, I don't see this discovered app. I guess I'll try again tomorrow, and then if it's still not there, maybe I'll put in a ticket, and then it's going to magically appear, and I'm going to scratch my head and move on, right? That you will hit that. And some people are going to say that, you know what, that's great. Now I'm not responsible for it. And sometimes that is okay, and sometimes it's not. So that's even, I guess, a decision. And you know, part of the decision when you're considering Intune versus config man is, you know, what sort of things are you willing to give up control over, and how much are you comfortable relying on the support from Microsoft? You know, which everyone's got mixed experiences with it. You know, it's all over the board.
Absolutely. We're coming up to the top of the half hour. I think we're going to run out of time. I always love talking about code management. I remember talking about it like 8 years ago at an event in London, in WMUG, when it's really enjoyed it. There's been some good changes along the way. I think it really helps to serve a purpose for many organizations, solves a lot of problems, especially it helps against, the fear of the big bang move. Okay. So definitely a fan of it. We've got a few minutes. We're going to do a bit of a giveaway now. So I think if I'm right in saying we're giving away 2 Ferraris, aren't we, Natalie? No, I'm joking. That'd be nice. We got a couple of Lego cards to give away. I think $100 each. So that's pretty cool. So if you're interested in that, we're going to run a Swagit. So when I start the draw, you just need to go to swagit.io. If anybody wants to type that so our attendees can see that.
We could probably actually publish it in the Q&A, the link, so they can click on it itself.
Cool.
Might not be a bad idea. Make it a little bit easier.
Yeah,
I just posted it there.
Okay, awesome.
So head over to swagit.io, enter the code 1666 along with your name. We'll give you a minute to do that, so be quick, and then we'll do the draw.
And one thing is, if you do win, go ahead and snap a screenshot because it'll pop up. I've got a little number and, hey, you won. Go ahead and snag that because that'll be what we want to see when you send us an email showing you've won.
Yeah, I think somebody's going to put it in the Q&A so you'll see it. But we'll give it a couple more seconds. We've got a few entrants. Cool. So I'm going to hit start draw. Last few seconds to get your entry in. 3, 2, 1. Cool.
And we will do one more.
We'll do one more. So if you didn't get in time, hold tight. So if you see your name come up on the screen, just take a screenshot. And if you email marketing@patchmypc.com, and we'll get you your card sorted out. So congratulations, Shane. Woo. That's awesome.
Hopefully you like Lego.
Congrats, Shane.
Cool. Okay, we're just gonna run one more. So same again, swagit.io. We've got a new code this time, 3022. This is our last entry to win a $100 Lego card. If you didn't get your entry in before, get it in now. We'll leave this open for just a minute.
Yeah, I say we'll give you a couple minutes here. No, Swagit sometimes. I've considered making a free draw website like this because we've totally crashed Swagit a couple times.
Okay, here we go. It's good. I'll maybe give it a little longer this time.
And it's been asked a couple times. I think one thing I'll mention while we're just kind of hanging out here. Yes, this is recorded. Yes, we'll share it on YouTube. Yes, we'll share out the slide deck. And I think there's even a couple slides maybe we didn't quite cover, right? There's a lot of info in there. There's a lot of great links. And yeah, recorded.
And absolutely go and check. Go to our YouTube channel for Patch My PC, and it's on our website as well. Search for webinars. We do this thing. We try and do it at least once a month, a webinar, and try and share some really cool info, like how we see it from the trenches.
Yeah.
So hopefully it's valuable. The last one we did was on the Cloud Management Gateway, which was really cool, really well received, had a ton of useful information. So if you're using code management for your internet-borne devices, you're probably going to be thinking about a CMG if you haven't got one already. So that webinar is going to be really good to have a look at.
And there's a fun one here, right? If your end goal is to be full Intune shop, would this be a way to transition? I'd say, yeah, right? That is a component of this. That's something you can use this for, right? It is co-management. There's some jokes from when this all came out. It was like, oh, the bridge, right? Is co-management a bridge or a destination kind of thing? And some of the initial conversations made it sound like this was Microsoft trying to get people into Intune. And it does provide that tool set, right? You now have the flexibility to transition workloads and to migrate if you want. But you also can just stop in the middle and say, hey, you know what? This is really working well. So yeah.
And I would also encourage you, like, just try, Intune native as well, Azure AD join. Just try it maybe alongside, get a pilot going. You might be surprised at what you can do. So there's one of the big misconceptions I see is like, well, if I do Azure AD join and Intune enrolled, how can I then authenticate to my domain resources if I want to connect to a file share or something over a VPN? And as long as you have AD Connect in place and you're synchronizing identities, single sign-on will absolutely still work. There's a ton of good information out there on how that does work. So
Hybrid Cloud Trust comes into play. There's a whole bunch of different resources for that as well.
All right, I think it's slowed down pretty good. Let's do it.
Start the draw. Okay, so this is the last one. Good luck, everybody.
There does seem to be a bit of chatter for, like how the content work. So when you're dealing with these apps or updates from, hey,
congrats, Robert.
Awesome.
Get that screenshot and email marketing@patchmypc.com. We'll send you your prize. Congratulations. Sorry, Cody, you were saying about content.
No, you're okay. So with content, when you're doing these updates, if you're doing Windows updates through Intune, they're going to come down through the Microsoft CDNs, the Content Delivery Network, right? And those are all over the world. That's their servers. They host them. It's not going to cost you anything, but your clients are going to attempt to reach out and get the content from there. There's a lot of configuration you can do with delivery optimization, and that's going to let you control that download a bit, right? You will have some flexibility about like should it be able to do peer-to-peer? Should it just go straight to Microsoft? What's the speed in the background versus foreground? Where if it's an automatic scheduled update versus I went in, I clicked install, right? Those behaviors can be different. You can do limiting. There's a lot of flexibility. So you're going to want to lean on delivery optimization. It is a little different, right? You don't just have Windows CCM cache and you can go dig into it and go look, because it's all bit level, right? It's just, you can even share parts of the content. You can download an update and download it, like different parts of it from 12 different clients, right? You're not just going to go and grab server 2012 December patch.cab from a client. You're going to go find a bunch of clients that have parts of it, and you can even start to share before you're done downloading as part of delivery optimization, right? So that's even going to help in a scenario where you don't have a distribution point anymore. You don't have pre-caching necessarily, but all of your clients are going to immediately just turn into a hive, and they're going to start sharing in hopes of reducing the amount of net bandwidth you pulled from the internet. So there's some flexibility, and there are some other resources. Microsoft Connected Cache, it used to be called like DOINC, DOINC. You can have a cache server, and it doesn't even require configman, actually. You can have a DO cache server. It's just an IIS component, right? You can set that up as well. It doesn't require configman, but they leveraged it and then made everyone know it exists. But it existed before that too. So you can do DO caching on a server if you want. That's a thing. But on the flip side, it's supposed to work pretty well. Your devices in your house use it. You don't even know it.
Yeah. And like to that point as well, the CDN for Microsoft stuff. Yeah. Like if you still want to have your third-party updates coming from WSUS, that's cool. Absolutely fine. They won't come from a CDN. They will come from your software update point. So when you're designing your cloud management gateway, you still want to get your content sent to that Cloud DP instance. Okay, so your clients can download it from your software update point. But yeah, you don't need, and I've seen this before as well, you don't need to distribute content from Microsoft updates to your Cloud DP. They'll just reach out to the CDN, like Cody said. Cool. I think we've used up all our time and gone over. So with that, thanks everybody for joining the webinar. It's always great fun to get together as a team here and present to you. Hopefully it's been useful. Give us feedback. Did you like this stuff? Do you want to see something different? Do you want to see something more? Do you not want to see me anymore? Anything, like give us feedback, and we'll try and shape these so they're useful. That's our goal here, so that this content's useful for you. So thanks for giving up your time and coming along. I wish you all a good day.